I don't carry a weapon into interrogation rooms. Just a bare right hand. They always tell you not to touch the suspects, unless you're putting the cuffs on, but a firm handshake usually gives me everything I need. It's not a psychic parlor trick. It's just a raw flash of whatever was in their head right before the lights went out. Thomas Vance sat across from me in room 4. The press called him the Arlington Killer. 6 women dead, their skulls caved in, left neatly posed on park benches across the county. He looked like a substitute math teacher who got passed over for tenure. Beige cardigan, wire-rimmed glasses, cuticles bitten down to the quick. He smelled like dial soap and old, sour anxiety. Through the two-way glass to my left, I knew my partner, Miller, was watching. Miller breathes through his mouth and thinks cracking a suspect is just about yelling loud enough until someone pees their pants. He doesn't know about my shortcut. Nobody in the department does. If the brass knew my 90% closure rate came from parasitic skin-to-skin data transfer, I'd be dissected in a black site lab, not sitting here waiting for a pension. I justify using it because I catch the monsters. But if I'm sitting in this chair, talking to this mic, I have to be honest. I do it because I like the power. I like looking into the eyes of a psychopath and stealing the one thing they thought they hid in the dark. Vance hadn't said a word in 3 hours. Just stared at the grain of the scratched metal table, his breathing shallow and even. I leaned forward, scraping my chair against the linoleum. The harsh sound made him flinch. Good. I needed his heart rate up. The transfer works best when the subject is rattled, when their adrenaline spikes and their mental walls crack. "It's over, Thomas," I said. My voice was low, coated in a thick layer of fake, maternal empathy. "Miller out there wants to throw you in a concrete box and throw away the key, but I don't. I just want to understand why she had to die." I extended my right hand across the table, palm open, an offering of salvation. Vance hesitated. His pale, watery blue eyes flicked from my face to my hand. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, a low, relentless, insect-like buzz that vibrated in my teeth. He slowly reached out. The second his clammy skin met mine, the air sucked out of the room. It's always the same sequence. A sharp smell of ozone, a violent crackle of static behind my eyes, and then the plunge. I braced my mind for the blood. I prepared to see the dark park, the wet grass, the terrified face of his last victim, realizing she wasn't going to make it home. I gripped his hand tighter, waiting to see his latest victim's final moments. Instead, I tasted copper. The air suddenly smelled like lavender and burnt toast. My living room. I was staring down at the faded Persian rug my mother bought me at a flea market 10 years ago. But I wasn't looking through Vance's eyes. I was looking through my own. I saw my own hands in the vision, my knuckles white and trembling, wrapped tight around the wooden handle of a heavy steel claw hammer. The metal claws were slick, dripping something thick and dark onto the wool fibers of the rug. A man was on his knees at my feet, bleeding. It was Vance, the substitute math teacher. Only he wasn't calm anymore. His beige cardigan was soaked dark red at the collar. He had his hands up, shaking violently, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "Please." Vance's voice echoed in my head, high and utterly broken. "Please stop. I didn't mean to look. I swear to God I won't tell them. Please." The hammer in my hand swung upward. The memory violently snapped. I yanked my hand back so hard my shoulder popped. The metal chair screeched as I shoved backward, hitting the cinderblock wall. Beale hit the back of my throat, tasting like battery acid. I swallowed it down, gasping for air that felt too thick to breathe. Room 4 came back into focus. The hum of the lights. The suffocating smell of dial soap. Vance was still sitting across the table, but the dead-eyed stare was gone. He was staring at me, his chest heaving, his face completely drained of blood. He wasn't looking at a cop trying to frame him. He was looking at the monster from his own nightmares. He opened his mouth, his voice a ragged, terrified whisper. "You." The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. Miller leaned in, chewing on a toothpick, a styrofoam cup of black coffee in his left hand. He was completely oblivious to the gravity in the room. "You getting anywhere with this freak, or should I take a swing?" Miller asked. I couldn't answer him. I kept my eyes locked on Vance, who was currently pressing himself as far back into his chair as physics allowed, whimpering. I slowly lowered my hands under the table, out of Miller's sightline. My right hand was throbbing. I rubbed my thumb over my knuckles. They were tender, swollen. I looked down into my lap. The skin across my knuckles was bruised a deep, ugly purple, and packed deep under the edge of my right thumbnail, barely visible, was a tiny dried speck of rust-colored blood that absolutely wasn't there when I woke up this morning. I spent the next 4 minutes in the precinct bathroom, scraping my own fingernails with a rusted paperclip until they bled. I didn't care about the pain. I just needed to get his skin, or my skin, or whatever that dried brown crust was, out from under my body. If forensics ran a DNA sweep on me right now, I'd be the prime suspect in a case I was supposed to close. Miller didn't notice anything when I walked out. He was too busy staring at the two-way glass, probably imagining the press conference and his face on the evening news. I told him I needed air, that Vance was playing head games, and I needed a minute to recalibrate. He just grunted and told me to grab him a cruller if I went down to the bakery. I sat, in my unmarked Crown Vic, in the back of the precinct lot, the steering wheel sticky against my palms. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. It's a specific kind of tremor, the kind you get when your brain realizes it's keeping secrets from your conscious mind. I pulled out my phone. Last night was a complete blank. A dead zone, from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. My call logs were entirely empty. No texts, no location history either. I had manually disabled my phone's GPS at 9:45 p.m. I do that sometimes when I want to hit a dive bar and drink alone without the department tracking my every move. But I don't drink enough to erase 6 hours. I don't drink enough to invite a serial killer into my home. The drive back to my neighborhood felt like navigating a fever dream. The afternoon sun was too bright, bouncing off the asphalt and stabbing the back of my eyes. I rolled the windows down, but the air didn't help. I kept smelling it. Lavender, my own fabric softener, and that faint, bitter edge of burnt toast that always accompanies a bad psychic hit. When I unlocked my front door, the house was dead quiet. The air was heavy, stagnant, the way a room gets when it's been closed up for days. I walked into the living room, my boots clicking too loudly on the hardwood. There it was, the Persian rug. I dropped to my knees, right where I had seen myself standing in Vance's head. I ran my bare hands over the intricate wool fibers, digging my fingers deep into the pile. It was dry, perfectly clean. No red stains, no stiff patches where blood had dried and congealed. I closed my eyes and let out a shaky breath, a bitter laugh rattling in my chest. It was a glitch. It had to be. I'd absorbed too many sick minds over the last 10 years, and their residual garbage was finally bleeding into my own gray matter. I was just hallucinating. Then I leaned closer to the floor. The smell hit me. It wasn't just lavender anymore. It was bleach. Faint, but distinct, trying desperately to mask something metallic underneath. I stood up, my knees cracking in the silence. My throat felt like sandpaper. I walked into the kitchen and opened the cabinet under the sink where I keep the heavy-duty cleaning supplies. The bottle of industrial-strength enzymatic cleaner, the stuff I'd quietly slipped into my jacket from an evidence locker 2 years ago, was sitting right at the front of the shelf. The plastic cap was still wet. Beside it lay the claw hammer from my toolbox. I reached out and touched the wooden handle. It was damp. My phone buzzed in my back pocket, the violent vibration tearing through the quiet house like a chainsaw. I pulled it out, my heart hammering against my ribs. Miller's name was flashing on the screen. I slid the screen to answer, my voice tight. "Yeah, hey," Miller said, his voice loud and distorted by the shitty reception in the precinct basement. Tech guys finally cracked Vance's burner phone and pulled his location data from last night. "You're not going to believe this shit." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so hard the wood bit into my palm. "What did they find, Miller?" "He was sitting outside your house for 3 hours last night, between midnight and 3, just idling in his sedan right in your driveway. He didn't text anyone, but he recorded a 3-minute voice memo on his phone. I just listened to it. It's mostly static, but you can hear 2 people talking inside a house. At the very end, Vance starts screaming. He's begging you to stop hitting him. Lying to another cop is easy. Lying to your partner while you're holding the wet hammer you supposedly used to torture a suspect requires a very specific, very ugly kind of sociopathy. I guess I found mine. You're an idiot, Miller, I said, forcing a dry, raspy laugh from the back of my throat. I kept my eyes locked on the dark wood of the hammer handle, studying the way the grain darkened where the moisture had soaked in. I washed down 2 Ambien with cheap scotch at 10 o'clock last night. If he was in my driveway playing Blair Witch with his iPhone, I slept right through it. It's ambient street noise, or he's faking it to establish a harassment claim. Miller chewed his toothpick loudly, the wet smacking sound drilling into my ear through the receiver. Maybe. But the captain wants you back here. I'm emailing you the ROM AMP3 file right now. Listen to it. Tell me that's not your voice. He hung up. I dropped the phone on the quartz counter. It sounded like a gunshot in the empty kitchen. I left the hammer exactly where I found it and walked to the dining room table where my department-issued laptop sat closed. My shirt was stuck to my spine with cold sweat. The air in the house suddenly felt too thick, pressing against my eardrums, smelling heavily of that bleach and copper cocktail. I flipped the laptop open. The harsh white light hit my retinas, making me squint. I logged into my secure email. There it was. From Miller. Subject: Vance audio, driveway. An MP3 attachment. 3 minutes and 12 seconds long. I grabbed my noise-canceling headphones. I didn't want the sound echoing in the open space of this house. I needed it piped directly into my skull. I slid the padded cups over my ears, clicked the file, and watched the digital waveform load on the screen. It was mostly a flat line of white noise for the first 2 minutes. I hit play. Static hissed in my ears, the low, rhythmic thrum of a car engine idling. Vance's ragged, uneven breathing. He was terrified even then, sitting in the dark outside my house. Then, the sound of a car door opening. Footsteps crunching on the gravel near my rose bushes. A sudden, sharp friction. The sound of my living room window sliding up its tracks. The waveform on the screen violently spiked. A dull, heavy crack. The sickening sound of dense material giving way. I stopped breathing. The oxygen trapped in my lungs felt like it was turning to lead. Vance started screaming. It was the exact high, broken wail I had heard in his head during the handshake. Please, 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 stop. I didn't mean to look. I swear to God I won't tell them. Please. Another wet crack, a wet choking gasp from Vance. I watched the progress bar inch closer to the end of the file. My finger hovered over the spacebar, desperate to slam it down, to shut it off, but my arm was completely paralyzed. I needed to hear my own voice. I needed to hear myself shouting police codes, making a lawful arrest, acting in blind self-defense against a home invader. I needed an alibi for my own conscience. Instead, the audio captured a woman's voice. My voice. But it wasn't panic. It wasn't defensive. It was flat, conversational, and completely dead inside. You got sloppy with the girl at the park, Thomas. My voice whispered through the headphones, the audio picking up the metallic scrape of the hammer dragging against the hardwood floor. You left a partial footprint in the mud. I had to go back out there in the rain and erase it for you. Do you know how much trouble you caused me? Vance sobbed, his voice bubbling with thick fluid. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm not mad that you watched me do it. My recorded voice continued, devoid of any human empathy. I'm mad that you think I'm going to let you take the credit for my work. People think going insane is loud, like a cinematic explosion of voices fighting over a steering wheel in your head. It's not. It's quiet. It's finding a receipt in your coat pocket for a meal you never ate, or sitting in your own kitchen, listening to a compressed audio file of yourself casually confessing to 6 homicides. I ripped the headphones off. They clattered onto the quartz counter, the tiny speakers still hissing out the dead air at the end of the track. The silence in my house rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. I stared at the black reflection of my face in the laptop screen. Same tired eyes, same dark bags underneath them, same messy bun I tied up at 6:00 a.m. I looked exactly like the seasoned detective with a 90% closure rate. I didn't look like a butcher. My brain scrambled for a logical handhold. It's a deep fake. Vance had software. He cloned my voice to frame me because I was getting too close. But the bruises on my knuckles throbbed in time with my pulse. The dry blood under my nail dug into the sensitive skin of my cuticle. The wet claw hammer was sitting exactly 2 feet to my left. And then there was Miller. My stomach plummeted, a cold block of concrete dropping into my pelvis. Miller sent me the file. That meant he had a copy. That meant it was sitting on the precinct's secure server. Why didn't he arrest me? Why did he just tell me Vance was screaming? I grabbed my phone, my thumb hovering over Miller's contact. I squeezed my eyes shut, replaying his exact words from the call. It's mostly static, but you can hear 2 people talking. At the very end, Vance starts screaming. Miller is lazy. He's the kind of cop who skims the first paragraph of a coroner's report and guesses the rest. He didn't put on studio headphones. He listened to it on his crappy phone speaker in the noisy basement, heard the static, fast-forwarded to the loud part to see what the commotion was, and heard Vance crying over the sound of the hammer. He didn't hear my quiet confession hidden in the low frequencies under the car engine noise. But audio forensics would. Tomorrow morning, tech would run that file through a spectral noise gate, strip the static, and boost the vocals. My career, my freedom, my life. They all had an expiration date of about 14 hours. I pushed away from the counter. My legs felt like they were made of damp sand. I walked back into the living room, drawn to the Persian rug like a magnet. 10 years of touching murderers. 10 years of letting their twisted, rot-infested synapses bleed into my own neural pathways, just to close cases, You can't swim in raw sewage for a decade and expect to come out smelling clean. The transfer wasn't just a one-way mirror anymore. It was a sponge. I had absorbed so much of their sickness that my brain had quietly built a separate room to store it all in. And apparently, that room had a back door. I knelt on the rug again. The bleach smell was stronger down here. If I was the killer and Vance was just my patsy, why did I bring him here last night? What was I doing to him with that hammer? I pressed my palms flat against the wall. I shifted my weight, crawling toward the center of the pattern. The floorboards creaked. I stopped. I tapped my knuckles against the oak planks underneath the rug. Solid. I moved a few inches to the right. Tapped again. Solid. I crawled toward the corner near the radiator, peeling back the heavy wool. I tapped the exposed wood. It didn't sound solid. It sounded hollow. A dull, empty thud. I stared at the seam between the floorboards. There were fresh scratches in the varnish, the kind made by a flathead screwdriver being used as a pry bar. I didn't think. I just acted on pure muscle memory that didn't belong to my conscious mind. I reached into my right boot, pulled out my backup tactical knife, and wedged the heavy blade into the gap. I twisted the handle. The wood groaned, then popped up with a sharp snap. I lifted the loose floorboard and set it aside. The space between the joists was pitch black. I pulled my phone out and clicked on the flashlight, pointing the beam down into the dust. I stopped breathing. The light reflected off something shiny. Neatly lined up in the crawl space were 6 driver's licenses. 6 silver necklaces in small plastic evidence baggies. And sitting right in the middle, staring back at me under the harsh lead glare, was my partner Miller's missing gold detective shield. Finding a colleague's gold shield in your own serial killer trophy stash is the kind of paralyzing horror that doesn't make you scream. It just turns the blood in your veins to ice water and shuts your organs down one by one. I kept the flashlight beam pinned on the brass star, resting in the dust. Badge 7411, Miller. My chest heaved, pulling in the stale air of the crawl space. I remembered the exact Tuesday morning he lost it 3 months ago. He tore the bullpen apart, throwing files, kicking the water cooler, terrified the captain was going to suspend him. I had patted his shoulder. I bought him a stale cruller from the bakery downstairs. I told him it probably just fell out of his gym bag. I reached down and picked up the heavy metal shield. My bare thumb traced the etched numbers. My other half, the thing that drove my body while my consciousness was powered down, didn't just take souvenirs. It took insurance policies. It had meticulously gathered the Arlington killer's victims' driver's licenses to stroke its own ego. But it stole my partner's badge to build a frame job. If the department ever got too close, my alter ego was fully prepared to plant this badge at a crime scene and feed Miller to the wolves. The sociopathy of it was breathtaking. It was a perfectly designed safety net, woven by a parasite living in my own frontal lobe. But the safety net was useless now. The audio file was already on the precinct server. I dropped the badge back into the dust, slammed the oak floorboard into place, and scrambled back to the dining room table. The edges of my vision were vibrating with adrenaline. I ripped open the laptop. I had to wipe the MP3 file from the network before tomorrow morning. I didn't care how guilty it looked if the file vanished. A missing file is a procedural error. A digitally enhanced confession is a lethal injection. I booted up the department VPN. Miller is the kind of guy who types with 2 index fingers and uses his ex-wife's birthday for everything. I was logged into his secure webmail in 20 seconds. My eyes darted across the screen, the harsh blue light searing my retinas. I clicked into his sent folder. There it was. Vance audio. Driveway. Sent to my inbox at 1:15 p.m. I highlighted the row, hit delete, and purged the trash folder. Gone. A pathetic, wet laugh escaped my throat. I wiped the sweat off my forehead with the back of a trembling hand. I just bought myself time. I could go back to the precinct, manipulate Vance, gaslight Miller into thinking he misplaced the original device, and my eyes caught a bolded line in Miller's outbox. A second email. Sent at 1:05 p.m. 10 minutes before he called me to casually mention Vance's screams. The recipient wasn't me. It was addressed to the captain of homicide CC'd, to the director of audio forensics. My stomach violently dropped. The taste of battery acid surged back up the back of my throat. I clicked the email open, my hand shaking so hard the cursor jumped across the text. Subject: emergency vocal match request. Expedite. Message: Captain, I ran the raw audio from the suspect's burner phone through the basic noise reduction software on my desktop. I stripped the static and the engine noise. The secondary voice on the track isn't a victim. It's the killer. I've attached the isolated vocal track. I need the lab to run an acoustic biometric match against our internal HR files immediately, specifically against my partner. Do not notify her. He knew. Miller didn't just listen to the static. He didn't just hear the screaming. He heard every single dead, apathetic word I said to Thomas Vance on that recording. The phone call to me wasn't a lazy cop sharing an update. It was a test to see if I would panic. It was a trap to keep me away from the precinct while he pulled the trigger on my career. I stared at the screen, the words blurring together as the oxygen stopped reaching my brain. Then, a rhythmic, sweeping flash of color caught the corner of my eye. I slowly turned my head toward the living room window, piercing through the gaps in the sheer white curtains, painting the walls of my house in alternating, violent strokes of red and blue, were the silent light bars of 3 unmarked police cruisers idling at the end of my driveway. There's a specific protocol for raiding a cop's house. You don't use sirens. You use overwhelming, quiet force. I watched the red and blue strobes slice through the dust motes in my living room, painting the pale walls in violent, alternating strokes. I didn't run. Running just turns you into target practice for the perimeter guys. I systematically moved through the kitchen, my bare feet silent on the hardwood. I grabbed the wet claw hammer from the counter. I opened the dishwasher, shoved the heavy steel head into the bottom rack behind a row of dirty coffee mugs, poured a cup of bleach over the racks, and hit the heavy wash cycle. The water roared to life. It wouldn't destroy a deep-tissued DNA profile, but it would buy me 20 minutes of bureaucratic confusion if they tossed the house without a warrant. Then, I walked to the hallway safe, typed in the code, 8241. I pulled out my department-issued Glock, racked the slide, chambered around. I wasn't going to shoot at my own guys, but I wasn't going to answer the front door empty-handed either. I pressed my spine against the wall next to the front window and peeled back a half-inch of the sheer curtain. 3 Ford Explorers, unmarked, sitting bumper to bumper at the curb, blocking my driveway. The light bars were flashing, but the headlights were dead. I held my breath, waiting for the doors to open, waiting for the tactical vests, the shields, the inevitable sound of boots stomping onto my porch. The engines just idled, a low guttural vibration that I could feel in my molars. 5 minutes passed. 10, just a silent strobe light disco bleeding through my window. A bead of cold sweat tracked down my ribs under my shirt. They were playing a psychological game, sweating me out. Miller probably told them I was armed, unstable, and prone to violent outbursts. I tightened my grip on the Glock, my thumb hovering over the safety. The purple bruise on my knuckles throbbed in rhythm with my heartbeat. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Not a ring, a text. I kept my eyes pinned on the lead explorer and fished the phone out with my left hand. Message from unknown number. Look closer. I frowned, my heart slamming against my sternum. I shifted my angle against the window frame, squinting through the harsh glare of the strobes. I focused on the driver's seat of the lead car. The streetlights overhead cast long, deceptive shadows, but I could make out a silhouette resting against the steering wheel. Not sitting up. Slumped. I swallowed hard. I lowered the Glock, my fingers slipping off the trigger guard. I unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The humid summer air hit me like a wet towel, clinging to my skin. I walked down the driveway. The loose gravel bit into the soles of my bare feet. My shadow stretched out into the street and snapped back with every rotation of the police lights. As I got within 10 feet of the lead car, the smell hit me. Not the ozone of the memory transfer. Not the harsh chemical burn of bleach. Copper. Hot, fresh, suffocating copper. I reached the driver's side window. It was rolled all the way down. Miller was in the driver's seat. He was wearing his cheap gray suit. The one he always complained was too tight across the shoulders. But the collar wasn't gray anymore. It was soaked a dark, heavy liquid red. His head rested against the steering wheel at a brutal, impossible angle. His throat had been opened up from ear to ear, the wound yawning wide, like a second mouth in the flashing lights. And resting gently on the dashboard, placed right over the speedometer with meticulous, mocking care, was a single sprig of dried lavender. My stomach violently rebelled. I staggered backward, gagging on the sour taste of bile that rushed up my throat. Miller was dead. The email was sent at 1:05 p.m. The drive from the precinct to my house was 40 minutes. He didn't call me from the basement. He called me from my own driveway, right before someone sliced his vocal cords. I looked down at the puddle of blood pooling on the floorboard beneath Miller's dangling left hand. Sticking out of the thick crimson mess was a burner phone. It was vibrating. I used the edge of my shirt to reach in, avoiding the pooling blood, and grabbed it. The screen was cracked, smeared with Miller's DNA. An incoming call from a blocked number. I swiped to answer and held it an inch from my ear. "Miller, you there?" It was the captain's voice. Gruff, out of breath. "I just got your email. The biometric match came back from the lab on that audio file you sent. You're completely off base, son. The secondary voice on that recording isn't your partner." I froze. The humid air suddenly felt like the inside of a meat locker. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice shaking so violently I barely recognized it. The captain paused. The line hissed with static. "Who is this? Where the hell is Miller?" "It's me, Cap." I choked out, staring at the gaping wound in my partner's neck. The voice on the tape. "If the lab says it's not me, who is it?" The line was dead quiet for 3 agonizing seconds. When the captain finally spoke, his voice was hollowed out by absolute bureaucratic dread. "The biometric match is identical to a profile we've had on file for 20 years. The voice on that tape belongs to your mother. When I was 12, I watched a feral cat eat its own litter under our back porch, and I remember thinking it was the most honest display of motherhood I had ever seen." Nature doesn't nurture, it consumes. I didn't say goodbye to the captain. I just hit end and dropped the bloody burner phone back onto Miller's lap. The cracked screen went dark, swallowing the only tether I had left to a sane reality. My mother has been dead for 12 years. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. I watched her take her last raspy breath in a hospice bed that smelled of ammonia and cheap floral perfume. I watched a backhoe dump dirt over her pine box in the frozen ground. But the captain doesn't make mistakes with biometrics. If the system matched the vocal print, it matched it to her old Department of Corrections file. She was a senior guard at Rikers Island. She had a voice like crushed glass. I stood there in the flashing red and blue lights, the thick scent of hot copper mixing with the humid summer asphalt. I stared at the sprig of lavender resting on the dashboard. lavender and burnt toast. That was the smell of the psychic transfer. The warning sign before the plunge. But it was also the smell of my childhood home. I reached through the open window and pressed my bare hand against Miller's cheek. The skin was still warm, yielding under my fingertips. I didn't want comfort. I wanted a memory. I needed the violent crackle of static. I needed to see who stepped out of the dark and swung the blade across his throat. Nothing. No ozone. No plunge. Just the sticky, sickening reality of dead flesh and ruined arteries. The transfer requires a living pulse, a frantic heartbeat to bridge the gap. Or maybe my brain was just building a firewall, locking me out of my own crime scene. I wiped my bloody fingers on my denim jeans and backed away from the cruiser. The neighborhood was dead quiet. Nobody was peering through their blinds. Suburbia has a funny way of minding its own business when the police lights are flashing. I turned and bolted back into my house, my heart hammering a frantic, bruising rhythm against my ribs. The dishwasher was still violently churning in the kitchen, scalding the claw hammer. I bypassed the kitchen and dropped to my knees in the living room, tearing the heavy Persian rug all the way back to the baseboards. The rug my mother supposedly bought me at a flea market. I dug my tactical knife into the gap and ripped the loose floorboard up. The oak splintered loudly in the quiet house. The crawl space gaped open like an open grave. The 6 driver's licenses? The silver necklaces. I ignored them. I shoved my arm deep into the black dirt between the joists, feeling around blindly in the dark beneath the foundation. My fingers brushed past broken glass and old dry cobwebs. Then, my fingernails caught on heavy plastic. I grabbed it and dragged it out into the harsh living room light. It was a thick, vacuum-sealed evidence bag, completely caked in a decade of dry rot and dust. I sliced the thick plastic open with my blade. The stale air trapped inside hissed as it escaped. I pulled out a heavily redacted psychiatric evaluation file from Rikers Island, dated 2006. The name on the tab was my mother's, but that wasn't what made the bile rise in my throat. Pressed flat against the manila folder inside the bag was a faded Polaroid photograph. It was a picture of me. I looked to be about 20, fast asleep in my childhood bedroom. But I wasn't alone in the frame. Standing right over my bed, her face blown out and obscured by the harsh camera flash, was my mother. She was wearing my clothes. And dangling from her right hand was a heavy steel claw hammer. Written in thick black Sharpie across the bottom white margin of the photo were 4 words in my own messy handwriting. I am her vessel. The hardest pill to swallow about sharing your brain with a dead sociopath is realizing they are fundamentally better at your job than you are. I sat cross-legged on the ruined floorboards, my thumb smearing the decade-old dust on the Polaroid. My mother was standing over my sleeping body, wearing my vintage band tee. 10 years ago. The math slammed into my chest like a crowbar. I closed my eyes and let the memory wash over me. The hospice room, the suffocating smell of ammonia, masking the stench of rotting internal organs. The exact moment the EKJ machine flatlined into a solid, high-pitched tone. I was gripping her cold right hand. Bare skin on bare skin. I hadn't inherited a psychic gift to help me solve murders. I had downloaded a parasite, a Rikers Island guard who spent 30 years marinating in the psychology of caged predators, who realized her own meat suit was expiring and decided to hijack her daughters. She didn't want to pass on peacefully. She wanted to keep working, and she was using my badge to do it. I shoved the photo into my back pocket. In the kitchen, the dishwasher gave a loud, final beep and shut down, plunging the house back into a deafening quiet. But outside, the silent red and blue strobes were still bleeding through the curtains. 3 unmarked explorers. Miller was bleeding out in the first one. Who the hell drove the other two? I gripped my Glock, the polymer handle slick with my own nervous sweat. I stepped back out onto the front porch, the oppressive summer humidity wrapping around my throat. The cicadas were screaming in the oak trees, a relentless white noise that made my teeth ache. I bypassed Miller's rolling tomb and crept toward the second SUV. Empty. Keys in the ignition, engine humming, AC blasting cold air onto vacant cloth seats. I moved to the third vehicle, also empty. I looked down at the asphalt. Smeared in a thin layer of street dust and morning dew were two sets of heavy tactical boot prints. They didn't lead toward my front door. They hooked a sharp right, trailing through the wet grass along the side of my house, heading straight for my backyard. I clicked the safety off. I kept my spine pressed tight against the damp vinyl siding, sliding my way toward the rear corner of the property. The metallic smell of blood from the driveway faded, replaced by the heavy, loamy stench of freshly turned soil. I rounded the corner. My motion sensor floodlight clicked on, flooding the lawn in a harsh, blinding white glare. Two plainclothes detectives from my precinct, Diaz and Chen, were standing near my hydrangeas. They weren't clearing the perimeter. They weren't holding their weapons. They were leaning heavily on shovels they had taken from my own garden shed, their shirts soaked in sweat. At their feet was a massive, rectangular hole. I raised my weapon, opening my mouth to scream a command, to freeze them in place before they could reach for their holsters. But the words turned to ash in my throat. Diaz reached down into the dark earth and grabbed a fistful of heavy, clear painter's plastic. He grunted, hauling the bundle upward. The plastic snagged on a sharp rock and tore open with a wet, heavy ripping sound. A pale, limp arm flopped out onto the manicured grass. Then a torso. The corpse was wearing a beige cardigan, soaked dark red at the collar. The skull was caved in, utterly ruined by repeated crushing blows from a heavy steel claw hammer. But I didn't need to see the face to recognize him. I recognized the bitten-down cuticles on his lifeless hands. It was Thomas Vance, the Arlington killer. My brain completely short-circuited. The gun trembled in my grip, the heavy steel suddenly feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. If Vance was dead, if his corpse was stiff, drained of blood, and rotting in my backyard from whatever my mother's ghost did to him last night, then who the hell did I touch an interrogation room for this morning? Sanity isn't a tightrope you fall off all at once. It's a bridge that rots out plank by plank, until one night you find yourself standing in your own backyard, pointing a loaded Glock at two men you buy coffee for every Tuesday. My arms were locked out, the gun sights bouncing erratically between Diaz's chest and Chen's face. The motion sensor floodlight cast long, grotesque shadows across the manicured lawn. The smell of wet earth mixed with the ruptured bowels of Vance's corpse was suffocating, coating the back of my throat with a thick, greasy film. Hands? I croaked. The word felt like it was tearing my vocal cords apart. Shh. Show me your hands. Diaz didn't reach for his holster. He didn't even flinch. He just leaned his weight on the wooden handle of the shovel and dragged the back of a filthy wrist across his forehead, smearing mud over his eyebrow. He looked annoyed. Not terrified, just deeply, fundamentally inconvenienced. Put the piece away, boss, Diaz sighed, his chest heaving in the muggy air. We're already charging double for the humidity as it is. Don't make this weird, boss. The word hit me like a physical blow to the sternum. Who is in the bag? I demanded, my finger tightening on the trigger guard. If that's Thomas Vance in the dirt, who the hell did I interrogate this morning? Chen scoffed, kicking a heavy clod of dirt into the massive hole. You're doing that thing again. The fugue state. We told you mixing the Ambien with the bourbon was gonna scramble your hard drive. Answer the question, I screamed, the sound echoing off the vinyl siding of my house. Diaz exchanged a tired, heavily coated glance with Chen. The guy in room 4 was a nobody. A homeless junkie from the warehouse district you picked up last week. You paid him $5,000 out of the precinct slush fund to put on a beige cardigan, wear wire-rimmed glasses, and sit in the box. He was supposed to confess to the Arlington murders, take a plea deal, and close the case so the feds wouldn't come looking for the real Vance. My stomach completely inverted. The blood rushed out of my head, leaving a high whining ring in my ears. The raw flash in the interrogation room. The scent of burnt toast. It wasn't Vance's memory I absorbed. The junkie didn't have any murders in his head for my psychic parasite to latch onto. He was a blank slate, so when I forced a mental connection through the handshake, the psychic current had nowhere to go but backward. It bypassed my conscious mind, breached my own internal firewall, and pulled up my own encrypted files. I didn't steal a memory from the man in room 4. I accidentally watched my own mother kill the real Thomas Vance through the eyes of my own repressed trauma. And because the transfer is a two-way street, the junkie saw it too. That's why he looked at me with absolute, bottomless terror when I let go of his hand. That's why he whispered, "You." He didn't recognize me as a cop trying to frame him. He recognized me as the butcher swinging the hammer. My gun arm started to lower. The heavy polymer frame dragged my hand down toward the wet grass as my muscles gave out. The pieces were interlocking, forming a picture so monumentally ugly I couldn't breathe. He panicked, I whispered, the realization coating my tongue in ash. After I touched him, he panicked. Yeah, he did. Chen said, his voice stripped of all professional courtesy, purely transactional. Soon as you left the room, he started screaming, banging his bloody knuckles on the two-way glass, begging Miller to get him out of there, saying the lady cop with the dead eyes was a serial killer. I stared at the puddle of mud forming around my bare feet. So Miller heard him, Diaz interrupted, plunging his shovel back into the dirt. Miller pulled the driveway audio again. Miller put the pieces together. So you texted us to intercept Miller outside your house. We handled it. Sliced his vocal cords before he could call it in. Just like you pay us to. The nausea was absolute. I wasn't just a physical vessel for a rogue, dead vigilante. My mother hadn't just hijacked my body. She had hijacked my badge, my authority, and my payroll to build a goddamn syndicate. I was running a Black Ops execution crew right out of the homicide division, and my conscious mind was completely locked out of the boardroom. I looked back down at the ripped plastic at their feet. Vance's ruined skull stared blindly into the glaring floodlight. Where is the decoy? I asked, my voice completely hollowed out, dead on arrival. Where is the junkie from room 4? Chen didn't say a word. He just turned around, walked to the shadowy edge of the hydrangea bushes, and dragged a second, freshly sealed heavy plastic bag into the blinding white light. There is a specific, dead weight to a human body that you only learn when you're forced to hide one. It's heavier than grief, and a hell of a lot denser than guilt. Chen drags the second bag. The thick plastic tears the dew off the grass, making a sound like a wet lung collapsing. He dumps it next to Vance's open grave without breaking a sweat. Diaz lights a cigarette. The cherry glows orange in the harsh, blinding white of the motion sensor floodlight. You're slipping, boss, he exhales, blowing a thick cloud of smoke into the muggy summer air. You told us you hired a street ghost from the warehouse district, some anonymous junkie who wouldn't be missed. But you didn't even vet your own patsy. I lower the Glock. My arm is entirely numb, the polymer grip slipping against my sweaty palm. I stagger toward the second bag, my bare feet sinking into the cold mud, and drop to my knees. My bruised knuckles throb with a dull, heavy ache as I grab the metal zipper and rip it down. The smell of stale sweat and cheap holding cell soap hits me. It's the guy from room 4, the fake Vance. But he doesn't look like a terrified decoy anymore. His face is a bloated purple mass of ruptured blood vessels and shattered cartilage. His jaw hangs slack, completely unhinged from the skull. And the thick, dark bruising crushed deep into the skin around his throat wasn't made by a garrote or a zip tie. It was made by human hands. DS reaches into his soaked pocket and tosses a leather bifold wallet. It hits my chest and falls into the wet earth. Chen pulled it out of his sock before we bagged him. DS says lazily, flicking ash onto my manicured lawn. He wasn't a junkie. He was wearing a wire the size of a tic-tac glued to his sternum. I pick up the wallet. My thumbs smear mud across the worn leather. I flip it open. Staring back at me from behind a cloudy plastic window is an NYPD gold shield. Badge number 7412. Next to it is a laminated identification card for the Internal Affairs Bureau. The guy in the box wasn't a homeless addict hired by my dead mother's ghost to take the fall. He was an undercover IA rat, planted by the brass to investigate my impossible 90% closure rate. The pieces grind together in my head, tearing up the last remaining shreds of my sanity. The psychic transfer is a two-way street. When I grabbed his hand in the interrogation room, he didn't just see my trauma. My parasite saw his truth. She saw the wire taping his chest hair down. She saw the IA badge tucked into his left sock. She realized the precinct was actively building a federal corruption case against us. He didn't panic because I touched him, I whisper, the words scraping out of my dry throat like sandpaper. He panicked because he realized I knew exactly who he was. Chen scoffs, leaning his full weight on his shovel. Yeah, no shit. Which is why you didn't let him leave the building. I freeze. The cicadas in the oak trees seem to stop screaming all at once. The silence in the yard is deafening. What do you mean I didn't let him leave? Diaz takes another long drag of his cigarette, his eyes narrowing in genuine, irritated confusion. You really are glitching out tonight, aren't you? You didn't pay us to kill the IA rat. We were en route to slice Miller's throat in your driveway, just like you asked. You handled this one all by yourself. DS points the glowing cherry of his cigarette at the ruined corpse in the bag. You dragged him into the holding cell bathroom, beat his face in, and strangled him on the tiles. We just wiped the precinct security servers and hauled the trash in the trunk of the Explorer for you. No, I choke out, my lungs refusing to expand. No, I was in my car. I drove straight home. Look at your hands, boss. Chen says quietly. I look down. The deep, ugly purple bruises across my knuckles. The dried, rust-colored blood packed tight underneath the edge of my right thumbnail. It wasn't from swinging a hammer at Thomas Vance last night. It was from shattering an undercover cop's orbital bone 2 hours ago. And then, a drop of sweat rolling down my neck hits a patch of raw skin. A sharp, violent, stinging burn flares up right below my collarbone. I reach up with my left hand, hooking my fingers into the collar of my shirt, and pull the fabric down. Reflected in the harsh glare of the floodlight, I see 4 deep, parallel gouges dug entirely through my skin. Vicious, frantic, defensive scratches, still weeping fresh blood. I look back down at the dead IA agent in the plastic bag. Both of his hands are balled into tight fists, locked in early rigor mortis, and packed deep underneath his bitten-down fingernails are thick, bloody ribbons of my own flesh. They tell you that when a cop finally breaks, there's this loud cinematic snap in their head. It just feels like a warm, heavy blanket settling over your shoulders in the middle of a freezing winter. I knelt in the wet grass, the motion sensor floodlight burning my retinas. The humid night air was suffocating, thick with the smell of cheap soap and raw meat. I stared down at the dead internal affairs agent in the thick plastic bag. I stared at his locked, rigid fists, his bitten-down fingernails packed tight with bloody ribbons of my own flesh. My chest burned where he had gouged me, a violent, stinging heat radiating right below my collarbone. I reached out with my bruised, swollen right hand. I wrapped my bare fingers around the dead cop's cold, stiff knuckles. I gripped him tight. I waited for the ozone. I waited for the sharp, metallic tang of burnt toast and lavender. I wanted the psychic plunge. I desperately needed the comforting hallucination of my dead mother stepping out of the shadows to take the blame for the crushed windpipe in front of me. But there was no static, no crackle behind my eyes, just the deafening, relentless scream of the cicadas in the oak trees, and the wet squelch of Chen's shovel slicing into the earth. I squeezed the corpse's hand harder, digging my nails into his graying skin. Nothing. The firewall in my brain didn't just crack. It dissolved entirely, washing away 10 years of carefully constructed delusions, and the raw, unfiltered data flooded my primary drive. I saw the precinct holding cell bathroom, not through a hazy, second-hand psychic flash. I saw it in brutal, first-person, high-definition memory. I felt the slick, piss-stained tile under my boots. I felt the satisfying, sickening crunch of the undercover agent's orbital bone giving way under my knuckles. I felt the hot spray of his blood hitting my cheek. I heard my own voice. Not my mother's, mine, whispering softly in his ear as I crushed his trachea with my bare hands, telling him he really should have stayed behind a desk. The pieces of the shattered mirror in my head finally aligned, reflecting a monster so hideous I couldn't look away. The Polaroid in my back pocket, the vacuum-sealed evidence bag hidden in the crawlspace, the Rikers Island psychiatric evaluation. I didn't misread the name on the file in the dark. I just lied to myself. My mother was a Rikers guard, yes. But the psychiatric file was the one she smuggled out of the juvenile ward to protect me. The patient file was mine. I was the one locked in a padded cell after I took a claw hammer to my abusive stepfather when I was 16. I didn't inherit a psychic gift. I didn't download a parasite. I developed a brutal, hyper-violent, dissociative identity to survive the trauma of my youth. And I built an entire law enforcement career masking my own sociopathic urges as psychic intuition. Every time I touched a suspect, I wasn't stealing their secrets. I was just giving the butcher living in the basement of my own brain permission to come upstairs. There was no ghost. There was only me. And the butcher had just taken over the lease. DS grunted, throwing the last heavy pile of dark mud over the 2 plastic bags in the massive hole. He leaned his weight on the shovel handle, spitting a wad of flame into the grass. So what's the play, boss? We still got Miller bleeding out in the driveway, and 3 unmarked cruisers blocking the street. The neighbors are going to wake up eventually. I stood up, the cold mud squelched between my bare toes. The panic, the nausea, the frantic, terrified detective I've been playing all day. It evaporated like water on a hot skillet. Every knotted muscle in my shoulders completely relaxed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I looked at the reflection of my face in the cracked, bloody screen. The tired, conflicted eyes were gone. Staring back at me was an apex predator perfectly comfortable in the dark. I cleared my throat. When I spoke, my voice didn't tremble. It dropped an octave, grating out rough and heavy, sounding exactly like crushed glass. Drive Miller's car into the abandoned quarry on Route 9. I said, my tone perfectly flat, entirely devoid of human empathy. Text the captain from Miller's burner. Tell him the IA rat made Miller, and Miller had to put him down. Tell him Miller is going off grid until the heat dies down. We'll burn his apartment tomorrow, so it looks like he ran. Chen nodded, kicking the loose dirt flat over the graves. And the Arlington case? I looked down at the freshly turned earth covering Thomas Vance. I smiled, a cold, dead thing stretching across my face in the harsh white light. The Arlington killer is dead. We close the file in the morning and take the departmental commendation, I said, turning my back on the graves and walking toward the house. And then we find a new target. Get to work.